Minister, this is, I think, a very important bill that's being discussed in terms of the preservation of our national monuments, which are singularly involved with our ideas of culture and heritage. And apart from the idea of identity, of understanding who we are, who we were and who we are, and maybe who we will be in the future, they singularly point to the ambitions that have been arrived at in this country over nearly 2,000 years. And I think they're very, very important to the idea of Ireland in the future in terms of the tourism and economic perspective also. And we have a unique offering in this country, unlike anything else in the Western world, in terms of a history that goes back almost 5,000 years. And therefore, I think it's very important that we keep an updated register, that we keep an updated programme of dilapidation and understanding how we are supporting these monuments in our country. And if I could speak about Waterford for a moment, we actually in Waterford have 5 individual museum experiences, all built around the historical narrative, dating back to the Bronze Age and then to Norman times, the Vikings and Normans, and right up to date. And I want to pay special tribute to our museum curator, Eamon McEnany, who is retiring this year after nearly 35 years of diligent service, and not to Waterford, not to the southeast, but in actual fact to the National Archive and to the National Record. And I just worry about who is going to lift the mantle after he goes, because he has been an incredible servant to the preservation of the records of Ireland, our national and our native history. And with respect to that, we have a Viking experience in Waterford that runs under its base. It just shows how technology can be integrated now in terms of trying to interpret the monuments of the past. And we have a 3D hologram and virtual reality program in Waterford called the Viking Experience, and that's very successful. It's done in conjunction with support from SETU, and that is the way that I think the history has to be explained to the next generations, for them to really glimpse what it would have been like to be living in a Viking house or tower back maybe 1,000 years ago. And that's something I would like to see, being spun out in other areas, Minister. That's the best way in terms of trying to make the historical record contemporary. But with respect to the Viking experience, we have, and Mr. McEnany would know this well, we have a site that is largely has not been looked at or surveyed in any great detail in Waterford. It came up at the time of the motorway expansion, and a great number of artefacts were taken from it, but there remains great positivity around that site, and there was some discussion heretofore with bringing in researchers who would be well aware of the Viking experience to come and see, and potentially this settlement would be the oldest settlement outside of Norway or Scandinavia in the world, and I think that we should try and propel that. There's a great amount of learning to be had from it. But as well as that, Waterford is replete with very historic monuments, Minister, and I worry how many of them are actually on the monuments record. I'm aware even in my own parish we have the Knockeen Dolmen. We actually have 2 dolmens, the Knockeen and the Galstown dolmens. If I go up into West Waterford, I can visit the Ardmore Castle. If I come back into my own parish of Butlerstown, one of the finest tower castles, Butlerstown Castle, dating back to Norman times, and which there's been no work done on that castle by the OPW, to my knowledge, in 40 years. The only work that has been done to it is by the landowner on which it sits. He has tried to keep that castle somewhere right, but I made inquiries of the local authority in the last year about trying to get some remediation work to that. We have ivy growing out of it. We have some plants growing out of the walls. And straight away you understand the problems of regulation. We could bring in a FOSS grouping there, or maybe a local employment scheme, to point the walls, but they're not allowed to do it because they have to be certified in terms of doing the monuments. In order to do that, you have to do a study on it, and then you have to secure the funding, which is not easy because it's through the local authority, and they really only have funding to do 2 or 3 schemes a year. And so we have the position, as I say, where this landowner has been trying to maintain, and that is one of the finest examples of a tower castle outside of Bunratty that I know in the country, to maintain that site. And he has already poured money, the landowner, into it. And there must be a way to satisfy the 2 demands. One, where a landowner does not want to open a site to the public 365 days a year, but where the monument is preserved, properly preserved. for the national record. And I'd ask you, Minister, please, to ask your department officials what can be done to expedite that requirement. As I say, it's one of the finest examples of a tower castle, a Norman tower castle, anywhere in the country, Butlerstown Castle. And in addition, I'd also point to the Waterford walls, Ministers. You know, Waterford, the oldest city in the country, was a Viking settlement, and then later on, with the Normans, became a walled city. And we've had initiatives taken in the city where people have tried to do commercial development, and where they impinged on the local walls, they ran into trouble with the heritage officer, and subsequently commercial development was stopped. And we need to find a balance between trying to retain what we have in terms of our monuments and our history, but at the same time it must live side by side with our contemporary economy. Also, as I said, Minister, the regulation and the reservation appears to me to be a problem, and I would ask, in terms of the national monuments, what register do they have for the number of Norman settlements around the country, particularly around the southeast? And I'm thinking of two tower castles, one which is over in Grana in County Kilkenny, and the other which is up near Kilsheelan in Clonmel. It's actually beside the Dove Centre there. And I passed that tower castle, and I passed it for 30, 40 years. I see ivy growing out 60 feet from the ground. I see the walls crumbling. And to be fair to the landowner, I think he has probably sectioned it off because it's unsafe for visitation. But it's just being allowed to dilapidate, Minister. And I don't think, you know, once these structures are gone, they're gone. They're not coming back. And making them new again is not, you know, people want to see the history of what was there. And I would ask that we would find some way of trying to collate these buildings and prioritise them for some remediation. You've got to keep the water egress out. You've got to stop the ivy growing out through the walls. That's the very first thing in these. As I say, Minister, state funding is an issue, and I think education is also an issue. How do we try and make this history that we have, and many of us have grown up with it, probably germane to this generation who are, you know, captivated by modern technology and TikTok videos of what's going on in the rest of the world, and maybe the historical narrative is not something that they're that concerned with now, but they will be in time. But the question is to try and make it real, and I think we can do that, but we need to have education pointing in our schools, particularly our national and secondary schools. And we all went through, I'm sure, the challenges of Ferdia and Grania and Cuchulainn and all of that. I'm not sure how much of that is taught in the modern syllabus today. And that's a pity because, you know, it speaks to an Ireland long ago, but it is still to be seen in our public realms. I'd also ask you, Minister, about, I'm sure, Minister, you would be aware of the old agricultural phenomenon of the List field. And the List field was often a fairy fort that was left on land, and you do see them in parts of the country where the farmers who were sensitive to them refused to bulldoze them out of it. And the old farmers would say to you that you'd get bad luck for taking out the fairy fort, but not to go inside and sleep in it, or the fairies would take you away. That's what I was told when I was a child. But they're still there. But there is no support to those, Ministers. For farmers or anybody else, they actually have to cultivate outside them. They're given nothing for the fact that there may be a half an acre of land that they could do something with. And more importantly, I think they have to be collated in the record because they're such an important part of our rural landscape. And the same goes with Ohm stones and dolmens. And as I said to you, I have two dolmens in Waterford, very close to where I live. One of them is in excellent state of repair, the other not so much. And again, these are artefacts that are now becoming difficult for people to visit because landowners have, for their own reasons, had to stake off the lands and try and restrict access to them because people were going up and littering and having bonfires and parties and all the rest of it. So we need to find some way to protect all of this. But Minister, I think the most important thing we need an up-to-date record of the significant important monuments, and I'm sure it doesn't reflect the full historical value of what we have in any county in the country. And secondly, then, we need a programme as to try and identify those which are in need of the most serious remediation. And we can do that. And I'm not sure that we need people who are qualified archaeological stonemasons to try and support some of these structures. You know, if we're waiting for all of that, they will have fallen down by the time we get to that point. So I would ask that we would look at some of this regulation around this. You know, there's a rich and diverse and historical history here for the people of Ireland. It must be maintained. It must be accessible, and I would ask that, you know, whatever the direction of this bill in terms of giving the ministers oversight of projects that either are included or are excluded, but that we keep this historical record alive, because I think possibly long after we are gone, the next coming generations will see the value of this far greater and in far greater detail than we will.